Okay, we're recording.
Okay, so so that everybody knows, we typically reach out to researchers and authors for them to present their peer-reviewed publications. But when we saw Dr. Ramyar's executive summary on the risk assessment of post-viral illnesses, we really jumped at the chance to have him share his thoughts with us. And this is an area for those of us who've lived with this for a really long time, or even newer patients, especially the long COVID patients, we're shocked that there's not a greater emphasis being placed on this already when it comes to treatment approaches to post-viral illnesses and similar diseases. And we're very grateful that he's joined us for this July 2021 journal study group. Dr. Ramyar is a founding contributor, chair, and strategy advisor for Doctors with ME, which is a global professional organization of medical practitioners, scientists, and researchers in the field of ME. This group includes leading international experts in the field of post-viral disease and related conditions. A visiting scholar at London's Institute of Banking and Finance, he holds a law degree, an MBA, and a PhD, and has had pre-pandemic interest in the industry and the macroeconomics of public policy versus post-viral diseases, and has advocated his views in British Medical Journal and has presented in a variety of areas as expert witnesses to legislators, government, and regulators. We're very glad he's here.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. My background is somewhat multidisciplinary, shall we say, which falling into ME in the way that I did has proved a blessing, for want of a better way of putting it, because what I've been doing is joining the dots between the legal picture and the policy picture, which is almost the same thing, but not quite. Both of them with implications for the compliance side of things. But as well as that, tying it into the actual scientific picture as well, overall. Although my background is in a mixture of law, business, economics, and technology, on the PhD side of things, very hardcore in terms of the quantitative side of things, computational statistics, behavioral finance, and frankly, the kind of things that make techniques that have been rather poorly implemented, even on the very elementary type of techniques, but very poorly implemented in the literature base that defines medical norms, the biopsychosocial world, etc. It's allowed me to very much understand the picture on the research front in detail. In terms of ME and me, if I may use that phrase, despite it being the name of Dr. Hing Robin Brown's book, I'll steal it for the purposes of my explanation. I fell ill with a tropical virus while traveling for work and ended up with suspected ME. I was very lucky to have a GP at the time who was alert. I was a locum GP who's sadly no longer there. And then, whilst already suspected to have ME, I then came down with shingles. So for entertainment value, I had a post-viral combination. So I don't know if that makes it ME squared or what, but it's definitely meets much of the caricature of how many of us have fallen into ME. You were saying, Sally, that when you first saw the draft post that I put up in relation to the compliance picture, it caught your eye. And to kick off a conversation, I'd be really curious if you could give a little picture as to what made you think, that's something to talk about, because people come at it from different perspectives, and that would be really helpful.
Yeah, I think the idea of, this unspoken agreement, or this unspoken operational method in at least physical therapy, that there's a hierarchy of diseases, and that certain diseases are due red flag warning signals and others are not. So if somebody with cancer comes through your clinic and you identify something that would be considered a red flag or a yellow flag warning signal of something, then you operate a certain way. But then there's this cluster of other illnesses that if you run across something that doesn't match up, you just kind of ignore it, and you aren't expected to go and study it. You're not expected to refer to a physician and have a conversation. You're not expected, if the physician drops the ball, to push and to find somebody else. And and that's, my experience as owning a private practice that specialized in people with complex issues was, we had a wait list of sometimes 6-8 weeks to get in, or longer. And it was, these are the people that are not being treated. They're not being met. Their needs aren't being met. So it's like, this isn't an isolated issue. This is, system wide.
Yeah. That makes sense. And to me, what you've said is rooted in, before I get into the nuts and bolts, it's rooted in two phenomena that there are out there that I think are the basis of much of the battles that people face and the professionals that they deal with, those who are alert to the issues. Number one, what is science? What is the scientific consensus in the field? What does that mean? Almost philosophically, what are we talking about here? What is science? Therefore, what's relevant? Therefore, what's important? Therefore, what can be enforced? Therefore, what can get someone in trouble? And then on the other side, we also have the very sad fact that there are, in most developed economies, in most mature jurisdictions, there are laws that govern discrimination. There are laws that govern the way that professional standards are implemented, even when discrimination isn't relevant. And those two things feed off each other, but often only when pushed. Only when people want to point out, look, there's a universal truth that comes from a statute. Statute says, I'll simplify it, don't be nasty. And don't be nasty to vulnerable people. At the end of the day, all these statutes roughly say something like that. Though there are very, very simple conclusions that can come from that people have to push for time after time after time. Regardless of ME, someone in another disabled situation has to push for some requirement that is facilitated and required by law, but it's just not going to happen unless they push and maybe even make a case out of it. And for me, that definition of what is science and the definition of what is someone's right, regardless of science, those are the two supposedly gray areas, which are often less gray than they first appear, which is where the structure of my thinking comes from. What I was going to do was chat through one, general requirements of law in the space when dealing with a patient of some kind, and then be a little bit more specific about compliance risks that are specific to ME, how those are underestimated, and how they frankly carry unnecessary liabilities as well, none of which benefit, but if you think about larger organizations, none of which benefit those organizations. Forget the patients for a moment. None of those liabilities, those risks are being assumed benefit the organizations at all. Quite the opposite. They add to a risk profile, which is very, very, very negative. And then also touch a little bit on what all of this means for the NICE review in the UK, the CDC's review, Cochrane, all these other reviews are going on at the moment, where at its most basic, where those reviews accommodate habitually contra-scientific belief systems, or where people facilitate ongoing unlawful clinical judgment or administrative decision-making, and I'm going to define that very specifically, it means that those guidelines must be ignored as a requirement of law and as elementary, the most elementary compliance, without need for any judicial review, which is a very British legal term, but in essence, courts jumping in to say whether an authority is being naughty, or some kind of test case. Because as things stand, it is empirically improbable that a clinician's judgment, a clinician, a practitioner, any professional, frankly, even outside the medical sphere, it's empirically improbable that a judgment of a professional regarding MECFS can be assumed to be safe, appropriate, or lawful. Full stop. And that leads to a generalizable obligation to procure education that's compliant with the scientific consensus. That's not happening. And any output that contributes to, coming back to the point to do with a function of law and ignoring any output that contributes to what I would describe as institutionalized malpractice and institutionalized discrimination, merely adds to the clarity regarding the legal obligation to ignore such guidance. So stepping back, making a little bit more solid and tangible. There are very general and very clear requirements of law. Forget ME, very clear requirements of law in pretty much any jurisdiction. And in brackets, that's ignored on an industrialized scale in the case of ME. So point one, if you're going to engage in some kind of clinical judgment or some kind of administrative decision-making, and it is to be lawful, it has to be done on a legally sustainable scientific basis. If under some form of cross-examination, the logic that someone is insisting upon, and I choose that word very, very specifically, cannot withstand a cross-examination in every literal and metaphoric meaning of the word, it's not legally sustainable. Therefore, it just can't be lawful. As well as that, lawful judgment or decision-making also has to be compliant with all other lawful requirements, whether that be in terms of discrimination law, non-fraudulent record keeping or communication, etc. But there's a very important corollary of all of this, very important other side of the coin. And it's something that we, within the ME community overall, to say we underestimate it is me being polite. We facilitate an enormous problem here. Medics do not define the law. Where a medic comes back and states that it is their opinion and that is final, they are merely asserting, well, they're merely writing down words. It's not of legal import necessarily. Medics cannot define the law and are its servants, as is any profession, lawyers included, even frankly, judges. They are servants of the law. They may administer it, but they are servants of the law. And that phrase, in quotes, clinical judgment, offers zero legal space for contra-scientific belief systems or opinions that have no legally sustainable evidence. That's not something that as a community we're used to picking up on. And that's something that we will be picking up on very, very, very decisively. As well as that, communication and record keeping with or about patients must account for lawful requirements, meaning one, it has to be accurate, and two, flip side of that, must not falsify information. Now, those general requirements, where we know there are specific compliance realities that come from those that are ignored, that are basically malpractice. What does this all really mean in ME terms? Number one, the scientific consensus in ME is legally demonstrable, full stop. And it's of immediate legal weight. What do I mean by scientific consensus? Well, we've seen all the discussions that there are out there. There's a bit of this, there's a humming of that, and someone's got an opinion and there's a controversy. Sorry, there is no controversy. There is only a controversy if someone debases the definition of science to accommodate individuals who are fundamentally illiterate in their approach to science. Their standards of probity, process, or otherwise are not compliant with the scientific process. And fundamentally speaking, that then leads to certain lines of conversation that challenge, sometimes on a very individual basis, it will happen, the very legitimacy of the words that come out of individuals' mouths, which will be construed as abuse at some point in the future, as opposed to a professional comment, which they will be invited to defend in the court of law if they so wish. But scientific consensus, what do we mean? Number one, and what I'm saying, you can remove the term ME, and you can put in cancer, you could put in bananas, you put in, I don't know, refraction of light, whatever. What is known about ME is contained within scientific consensus. What is known that ME is not, what ME is not, is a function of the scientific consensus. What is not known about ME is also very clear within the scientific consensus. And the broad areas for future research are also evidence within the scientific consensus. And the detachment of medical norms from this scientific consensus is not just a sentence, it's empirically quantified again and again and again, and in different spheres, from primary to secondary care, ER, whatever. There is zero controversy in the field, another area where the community missteps fundamentally, and we reply in ways that fuel the idea that a controversy. No, we shut down the conversation. We don't accept the premise. That's the way that things will begin to go. So there's zero controversy in the field, and as I was saying before, unless one debases the very definition of science to accommodate underlying low standards that are, and I'll put it very bluntly, risible in any field. If those standards were to be defended within any other medical field to a terminal level of cross-examination by peers, they would be laughed at. That's before you go to any other professional field where they are numerate. They would be laughed at the room, number one. Regulatory assessment of that statement I've just made is unnecessary due to the unusual clarity of legally demonstrable failure. Nonetheless, what do we have? A 100% regulatory failure of the literature that underlies medical norms. What do I mean by that? In the NICE literature review by people who included peers of individuals who insist on low standards, not in quotes so-called activists, that literature base, the biopsychosocial literature base, the literature base that underlies medical norms, 97% of those papers, 87% of those papers were ranked as very low quality. 13% of those papers were ranked as low quality. Now, we all have heard those numbers before, but not in percentage terms and not in a form that says 100% regulatory failure, which it is. It's 100% regulatory failure. And that's before considering the US Institute of Medicine, now renamed, but the self-regulatory review that was done in 2015, or if I recall correctly, 14-15, across that 9,000 odd literature base, article literature base. So how has all of this been masked? We've got terminal scientific and journalistic scrutiny that's been avoided through distraction, claiming offense, etc., when held to their colleague standards, because how dare we hold people to colleague standards, or by leveraging perceived eminence, including, I have to say, including targeting high standard scientists and peer review mechanisms, etc., to exclude high standards, just to make sure there isn't any sufficient keeping of standards. Now, this scientific consensus that I've just outlined, which I don't believe anyone can soundly challenge the idea that a scientific consensus, when it's defined the way I had done, that, again, I'll restate it, what is known about ME, what is known that ME is not, what is not known about ME, and the evidence and broad area for future research. That, frankly, is a bunch of bullet points that you can use to define any scientific consensus. And it does apply to ME, and I'll say it again, unless we accommodate the fundamentally illiterate. So that scientific consensus that I've outlined, it is proactively and unlawfully ignored and undermined on an industrial scale by medical belief systems. And I use the term belief systems because we are talking about belief systems, and it has a certain little nuance in our world. And we are correct to describe what's happening for some years as medical belief systems have been implemented. Ignored by those belief systems, ignored within client industries, and by that I'm including the financial services industry, and by bodies of state when confronted with ME. Now, that little clause at the end, when confronted by ME, keep it in your mind. It's very, very, very important. And that proactive ignoring and undermining on an industrial scale is either due to repeatedly and empirically quantified ignorance, which it generates the excess likelihood of unlawful clinical or administrative decision-making that I mentioned before, or if it's not because someone is inadvertently ignorant or persists in deciding to be ignorant, it's due to discrimination, maybe discrimination at the same time. It's a big word. It's a big word that's thrown around a lot. But what is discrimination? Well, I'm talking about discrimination that occurs when one is presented by someone with ME. Because in most mature jurisdictions, the very definition of discrimination, either in statutory and policy terms, is where there is an arbitrary / unjustifiable decision that is the direct result from presentation of some form of characteristic, i.e., there is a line of arbitrary / improper decision-making that is solely caused because of the existence of a specific characteristic that is protected in law, such as a disability, such as ME. So where you have occurrences that only happen because of ME, de facto is discrimination in law. So this institutionalized discrimination and this lack of knowledge of the clear scientific consensus and the divorce of medical norms from the scientific consensus that leads to arbitrary and unlawful implementation of policies on an industrial scale, commonly dealing with express mistruths, even in writing, frankly, as I'm sure many of you have heard stories of many times. Medics and their client industries, because stepping back a little bit to just describe what's happening overall, regularly, you can tell I say the first word too often, regularly and unlawfully suspend, because this is what we're talking about. We're talking about the suspension of legal norms and compliance requirements due to unscientific and legally unsustainable belief systems, and doing so on the arbitrary basis of an MECFS diagnosis or the relevance of it. I know I'm going in a circle, but I'm doing it to rub it in, because these are points that are so simple that have stood out with the very consciousness of the ME community that it doesn't sink in. So I have to go around in a circle on it. So that suspension of legal norms and suspension of elementary compliance requirements happening due to unscientific and legally unsustainable belief systems is happening on the arbitrary basis of ME being occurring, so to speak, thus substantiating discrimination in law. Now, let me give you a very specific example. Flu vaccination in the UK is one of very many common examples that's faced in the community, where the policy implementation requirements are crystal clear. The requirement is that where someone has a neurological condition, they should be offered the flu vaccination. Neurological condition is defined within the NHS Digital's SNOMED database, which is a version of the WHO ICD. So basically a list of classifications of this is that type of illness, that is this. And ME and its synonyms, because it basically all the synonyms are dumped in one place. Chronic fatigue, by the way, is not a synonym of ME or CFS within that bucket, is clearly there as a disorder of the, oh, sorry, that's Alexa telling me to take my LDN. Is clearly there as a disorder of the nervous system. i.e. a neurological condition, and on other NHS systems for lay people is listed as such as well. So there is no legal dubiety at all because the policy requirement is clear. But those policy implementation requirements are unlawfully contradicted as a norm. Why? Solely due to the presentation of ME itself, which is thus unlawful implementation of policy on an arbitrary basis. Why? Due to unlawful discrimination. There is no other explanation of it. Now, communication and record keeping requirements also commonly fail to account for normal lawful requirements of accuracy or the obligation not to falsify information. Again, why? Statutory discrimination is the basis for that, because someone is confronted with ME. So the number of times I have seen medical professionals put in black and white in letters to other specialists where patients are copied fundamental mistruths as to the nature of the meeting that occurred, that in itself, particularly when done only for a specific reason, which one could construe as discrimination, if we just shelve I'm not sure if complication is the right word, if we just shelve the fact that the gaslighting has been specifically trained to occur, that's fraud. And whether that particular point in that example I gave would stand up in court is another conversation, but I have no problem in describing it as fraud. It is also, I've even seen situations where medics, relatively senior medics who happen to have ME, themselves, the label ME is so sufficient to trigger the discriminatory suspension of legal norms and compliance requirements that they, as a professional, will be copied in on a letter about themselves about a meeting that bears no relevance to the appointment that was had. I have seen senior medics, some of the most senior medics in the country, in the UK, put in black and white, fundamental, let's use a nice word, mistruths about policy, about what the requirements of policy are, even when they are told prior to that the policy says these words, and there's no complication. And even if there were, they happen to be trained individuals. They're not primary school children. And yet there will be communication that comes out that is, again, I will be polite, does not meet compliance requirements. So the reality is we have a context of institutionalized breaches of lawful requirements and institutionalized discrimination, and just because it is habitual does not make that either excusable or legally sustainable. And more to the point, is merely evidence of its institutionalization, which has, particularly in the UK, a very specific legal and political edge to it, that word, due to its use in institutionalized racial discrimination context. A very, very important point with all this, because people often talk about informed consent, and it's a way in which we as a community will often feed and validate irrelevant premises. To believe that informed consent is required gives credence to the idea that it is consentable, gives credence to the idea that it is lawful, gives credence to the idea that the person who is relaying that information has scientific considerations that underpin what they're saying. That, quite simply, is not the case. So informed consent cannot be used to justify current institutionalized abuse of CBT or other institutionalized failings. Why? Because unlawful clinical decisions can never be lawfully consented to. It's as simple as that. Let me give a really, really clear example, because it's the kind of sentence that people will think, yeah, okay. But at the same time, there's that nagging suspicion of, well, the doctor said, therefore the court would listen. Well, number one, medics do not define the law. Medics are servants of the law. We have a cultural deference to lawyers. Sorry, to lawyers, perhaps not to lawyers. We have a cultural deference to medics. that occurs automatically. Very clear example, my own medic, despite the fact on occasion now, because of the ME world, I will have conversations that relate to him. People will refer to him by name. I can't, because he's my medic. I just can't. It's a cultural phenomenon. But that does not make what is said law. Here's the extreme example, euthanasia. Unless euthanasia is a lawful consideration in a country, no medic can either suggest it or prescribe it, let alone facilitate it or, in quotes, do it. You cannot consent. There is no informed consent available for euthanasia. Now, that may feel like an extreme example, but it's just as unlawful and unconsentable as any decision-making that's not based in the scientific consensus. Because that decision-making, that treatment suggestion was not lawful in the first place. It can't be consented to on an informed basis. So, and to boot, no clinician is going to say, I am going to advise against the scientific consensus in the case of ME. One, they probably wouldn't be capable of saying that anyway, because it's empirically quantified that they're divorced from the scientific consensus anyway. So it's a circular problem. But in reality, the current situation is even worse, because the scientific consensus actually expressly contradicts medical norms. And this is the crux of it. So there isn't even allowance for people to go off-piste and think, I don't have a treatment for you, I'll do what I want, because I've got some thoughts, I'm trying to be helpful, I'm a nice guy. The scientific consensus expressly contradicts medical norms regarding CBT, graded exercise therapy, etc., adding to the legal need to ignore any guidelines. I'm coming back to NICE, CDC, Cochrane, etc., that accommodate such scientific illiteracy and low standards. So informed consent laws, one could say that they're breached on an industrialized scale, because there are those clinicians out there who will make some allusion to the idea of controversy when they talk about this and then send someone off to do some graded exercise. And there is that history of training that specifically encourages those breaches, but it doesn't change the picture overall. Now, on that NICE, CDC, and Cochrane front, again, where there are processes that are occurring just now that accommodate or involve habitually contra-scientific belief systems, or people who are insistent proponents of them, they must be ignored. Those particular parts of the guidance must be ignored as a requirement of law and of elementary compliance and risk management for an organization. And again, I emphasize, without need for judicial review or a test case, because at its very, very, very basic, at its basic root, well, if I ask, how could that be true, what I've just said? Well, there is a scientific consensus. Everything, nearly all of these points come back to the very nature of one, what is a scientific consensus? Is there a scientific consensus in ME? And what is that scientific consensus in ME? Which, if guidelines come out that breach the scientific consensus, it's not an excuse for a medic. And when I say excuse, I mean, I'm talking indemnity insurance. I'm talking about validity of indemnity insurance. I'm talking about things that are much, much bigger boys and girls than the individual medics. Now, the long COVID is an interesting point within all of this as well, because we've got narratives that are occurring at the moment that delegitimize long COVID. They're in the broadest sense of long COVID. Now there are those people with long COVID who meet pre-existing ME diagnostic criteria. And that bunch, depends on how you cut the cake, The people who are cutting the cape seem to be dividing the long COVID people into either 3 or 4 groups. So, okay, conversation to be had. But in the ones who meet ME criteria, we've got solid, forgetting the ones who actually meet them, as well as that, in quotes, evidentiary terms. You've got BMA, so British Medical Association. We've got NIH and NIH narratives from Fauci down and others that all very, very clearly refer to the fact there are people with long COVID. There is a cohort among them that meet pre-existing ME diagnostic criteria. Now, despite that, there are efforts to expand the empirically quantified divorce of medicine from science into the long COVID arena. And what that will do is withhold the gains in frontline clinical and administrative understanding of ME from people with long COVID. So, put otherwise, however bad it is for people with ME, we have a trajectory. And it is a trajectory that there are individual interests. Some people refer to organizational interests. I do not believe that to be the case, because the shareholders at the end of the day know which side the bread is buttered on if they're made aware of it. But however bad it is for people with ME, the long COVID people would be better with an ME diagnosis. And we all too frequently are asking ourselves, should we be associated with long COVID, et cetera, et cetera? It's totally backwards. It's totally wrong. It's strategically misplaced. We are in the better position than them. When we're talking, and then people say, oh yes, but research. No, I'm talking frontline and administrative considerations of what is ME. However bad it is for us, we have a trajectory. We also have things we can point at that allow us to correct people who wish to collaborate, or in extremis, give them a hard kick. People in the long COVID world do not have that if they do not have an ME diagnosis to point at in most jurisdictions. And so we've got a generation of liability on an epic scale that's already accumulated. And that impending liability is going to be on an even more epic scale and mismanaged. I mean, we've got preliminary work that's putting the cost of this at 12 figures in US dollars before COVID even came along. I mean, we're talking massive money here. And that massive money in the broadest sense is the kind of thing that organizations can get on top of, can get ahead of, if they understand that people who tell them otherwise. In the article that I put out before, I described expertise risk. If organizations are alert to the expertise risk that they have in their procurement processes, and if they begin to understand that they are captives of illiteracy that is very, very expensive for them, we are going to see change, and that will happen. I've rabbited on for a wee while. One thing I'm so very, very, very conscious of, and it's where I would ask for some pushback, where you say, what about this? What about that? In the ME world, there is a fundamental misconception about what the limits on us are. There is a paradigm of don't be an activist, don't be seen as being an activist. This is misplaced in legal terms and in media terms, and there's a reason why it's misplaced. The paradigm and the terms of engagement are not ours. They were given to us, and we now self-police it. So at the moment, we live in a world where the ME community specifically says, you are an activist or you're not. You are a screaming lunatic, or you are polite and avoid dealing with issues that they don't want you to deal with. There's a fundamental problem in that weighing of the situation. You have issues that have to be dealt with in scientific terms. You have issues that have to be dealt with in legal terms, and you have issues that have to be dealt with in policy and public relations and media terms as well. And yet we have a paradigm that is fundamentally uncomfortable with that for very good historical reasons, but with terms of engagement that have been given to us. As we move forward and we break out of that cage, and as we move forward and we define the terms of engagement, which is based on the very definition of what is a scientific consensus, what is the scientific consensus, what is the reality of what's happening out there just now, and what are the obligations upon clinicians, either in statutory terms, policy terms, or professional standards, actually dealing with the core issues and responding to them becomes something that can be dealt with very directly and necessarily so, in the interests not just of patients, but of the professions, of the organizations, of the regulators, of their indemnity providers, etc. Why? Because anything else is just not good business. The situation in which we are at the moment is just frankly deranged. It's dysfunctional. It's a sociological phenomenon in itself, where we self-police ourselves. We self-police ourselves into ensuring that we don't have normal types of discussion that would be normal in any other medical field, any other professional field, which is something that we'll break out of. It's something that we'll get to. It's something that will be normalized. But in the meantime, where we are where we are. Would you like to push back on anything? Because I think that could be helpful. Anything from, I don't know, functional neurological diagnosis excuses, which is what they are at the end of the day, and they're not legally tenable either, to some other question marks. I can't promise to be able to deal with everything, but at least get the juices going.
Oh my gosh. First of all, mind blowing. Thank you. I'm so excited. I can hardly stand it, because this is like everything that's been in my head for all these years of why is this not, why aren't we talking about this? And I go to school with people that we slogged through our prerequisites to get into PT school that were, hard sciences and evidence-based treatment was beaten into our heads, but yet we don't act like that. We don't follow through with that. And then when we do, we discriminate. So, people put on these blinders and they use evidence-based practice when they want to, or with a subset of people, but then they eliminate the peripheral people that they just aren't interested in.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And it's just like, you can't cherry pick. I don't get it. I've never gotten it. And one of the things that I wanted to, all this reminded me of, I mentioned to you in one of the emails the article that Amber Ella wrote about her very severe friend Theo, who had been against his will institutionalized in a psychiatric situation for going to the ER for a very severe ME crash. He was losing, for background information for people who might be watching this, he was losing his ability to absorb nutrition and having trouble. And then simultaneously, we are aware of another situation where a family is being monitored with great magnifying glass type approach, also a severe case of ME. And what was interesting was how Theo's case, all the big international and national researchers and medical people kind of joined together to try to create a conversation with these people, and they still resisted it. Mm-hmm. And then in the other case, um, they've moved beyond some of the challenges and are now looking for some other forms of treatment, just not only to get treatment, but to prove follow through with clinicians that I personally have reached out to who have the initial phone call with me, but will not call me back.
Yep.
Or just hang up on me.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I'm just like, you've got to be kidding that
Yep.
you won't even talk to me about this case. And you know, it's like, it's another, you know, I'm your, okay, I'm medically retired, but I was your peer.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I'm not a crazy person, just, you know, calling and mandating that you must participate.
Yeah, the problem is, in the minds of many people, we are crazy people until such time that we change the narrative, which will be an extremely painful process, not because it will actually be painful, it's because there are people who are used to the narrative on our side, and they will be extremely uncomfortable with the change in narrative. But when we change the narrative towards what it actually is, about the definition of what is a scientific consensus, about what the scientific consensus is, and therefore what are the implications of the scientific consensus, everything begins to change. So I'll give you some specific examples that relate to the examples, or hypothetical and literal examples that relate to the examples you were giving, including in the article. And also relate to the frustration of my own that I was addressing and you've relayed to. Being nice and trying to persuade people has a limit. Where you have people who insistently reply, I have an opinion, I insist on my opinion, I don't care what you say, I will break the law because I have decided. What we have there is a fundamental violation of the basic premise that doctors do not define the law and they cannot engage in arbitrary decision-making, and it has to have foundation. And thereby coming back to the whole point to do with the scientific consensus and its implications. So what we have within the community overall as an unaddressed factor in terms of primary strategies, how does one deal with the intransigent? How does one deal with the, to deal with those who are inadvertently ignorant, fine, be nice. Where they were willing to learn. After a point, they become intransigently ignorant. And there are those who have other reasons, but frankly, it doesn't matter. People dwell on motivations. The end of the day, who cares? You just need a bigger stick to hit them with. And there's some very big sticks out there. Where there is a decision to detain someone in some setting, where there is a decision to withhold a diagnosis or insist upon another diagnosis, take FND, for example, where there is a decision to engage in some kind of social services action in relation to children, all of these come back to the simple question of what is your medical justification for this in relation to the scientific consensus that you are clearly breaching and contradicts you. Are you aware of the implications, of which there are a range of liabilities, all very, very conventional, that stem from this? Because when the proverbial hits the fan, it's clearly your fault, and I've just presented you with a line in the sand. That is how we will have to begin to deal with things. Now, there is an announcement on the Doctors with ME website in relation to submission to certain realities by the largest super partnership, GP partnership in England. It's possible that wasn't voluntary. I'll leave it at that. And it's possible there was a process of circular avoidance, possibly. Point being, enforcement or preemptive enforcement by statement of reality is what wakes people up. Compliance is not a new phenomenon. It's something medics are all used to. But what do we come back to the phrase I used before, suspension of compliance norms, suspension of legal norms, and the ability to just believe one can do what they want when there's ME, which includes belief. It is not legally permissible to say, I do not believe in cancer, go away and dress up as a chicken and you'll be better. And it is just as ridiculous versus the scientific consensus that is ME.
Yeah. Yeah. So are there any circumstances that you're aware of test cases that are moving forward in any situation like this where someone has been especially locked up or institutionalized? Seems like those would be the first level of legal action to pursue.
Let's put it this way. We have a world of horrors going on at the moment. So sadly, there's no shortage of horrors.
Yeah.
It's a question of having the base of what I've just been saying outlined and addressed in ways that are clear. And that's something that's evolving as well. I'll leave it at that. And then it becomes something which is citable when putting pressure. So if I go right back to the beginning, and I was talking about how there are two fundamental driving factors. What is the scientific consensus and what are your rights? Your rights can be fundamentally clear, but just because the law doesn't prescribe the obscure situation that someone might be in, and there's no test case about that, and so people will just ignore it, it doesn't mean that its very basic root, there isn't something being breached.
Right.
And that enforcement will occur less in court. Sure, it's going to happen. Most of it, and maybe even out of court settlements sometimes. But it's going to be less that. It's going to be more a case of, more often than not, frankly, it's just going to be letters exchanged where people become alert to the fact that they should be talking to their lawyers. Letters that make clear that the legal advice that you receive, where it is captive, or the reality is that legal advice is often habitually captive to flawed expertise, suffering from that same expertise risk, to volunteer very condescending help that would be very willing to inform your lawyers and discuss with them in detail the nature of the liabilities into which their clients are descending. That's the kind of thing that I think will breed the most change, because every single organization on a day-to-day basis makes sure, are we compliant with how we store data? Are we compliant with this new requirement about how we refrigerate some substance? Are we binning things that need to be thrown away because they're biohazard and we didn't used to think they were biohazard? There's a long list of things. There are teams that do that every single day. And that will be where most of the action is, I would say. And in the media, which we will get there.
What about, because my processing is slow, go back to at the beginning when you mentioned there was some part of it that you mentioned about like when the science is poor or they are disregarding the science. The idea is really you're proposing is just to ignore them as opposed to going after them because of they're just wasting time and they're just idiots and we don't need to engage with them.
Yeah, what I was referring to there was the library of excuses that can be used. So you have you have garbage in, garbage out situations at the very highest echelons. So you'll have nice guidelines, CDC content, Cochrane content, as much as nice or shuffling along with some progress, CDC with some progress. But you will have evidence bases, synthesized evidence bases that someone could point at and say, look, I'm not a bad guy. I'm just misunderstood. And I'm not letting go of my opinion. Those kind of guidelines, those kind that kind of output, that kind of body of work, which people often view almost in quasi-legal terms as being that it is of legal relevance, but it's not the law. That, where it is flawed, has to be ignored as a function of law. And so one could easily make the case, for example, that famed across the world because of its impact, the 2007 UK NICE guidelines have been unlawful in generating liability for financial services companies for a decade plus, depends on exactly how you cut the cake. There was a judicial review that was attempted in 2009, which for anyone outside of the UK or less legally orientated, a judicial review is where the courts, someone instigates a process in the courts to investigate whether or not a body of state, it's usually a body of state, if they have been acting out with their remit, out with their power, or in ways and processes that are not compliant with what they should be doing or how they should be doing it. So to caricature it, NICE can't suddenly write guidelines about, I don't know, bananas for Tesco's. It's outside their, Tesco's is a supermarket. It's outside their remit. In the same way, they can't suddenly put out guidelines on cancer that tell people just to eat oranges and it'll be okay. That's not compliant with the remit. So one can easily make the case that it's been, the 2007 guidelines have been illegal, unlawful, or should be ignored to, more correctly, should be ignored to avoid unlawful decision making, blah blah blah, for a long time. There was a point why I was saying that, and like you, my ME brain has now made me lose where I was going with that. What was I saying?
I think I was going after the idea of just ignoring them, and you've clarified.
Oh yes, there was a judicial review in 2009 that you may be aware of. Some people have heard of it, but cut a long story short, it was in a very almost quasi extrajudicial way. It was short-circuited. It was a fairly foul affair. It was never that it went to judicial review and the conclusion was it was okay and everything was fine. The process basically fell apart on purpose, the way that it was dealt with. Yeah.
And that was regarding the NICE guidelines. I was going to ask you if there's ever been any. I guess in America, you know, we call it, you know, when it's a group of people sue together, class action. Has there ever been any class action attempts against the guidelines for the PACE trial?
Well, the judicial review was less about, because class actions or group litigation, as it's termed here, is about liability for something. The judicial review that happened in 2009 was not about liability per se. It was a case of have they been naughty and writing nonsense in a naughty way, to caricature it. But there hasn't been any class action group litigation type scenarios as yet. Who knows? It's not impossible, but it's also, the problem with these things is that it's very diffuse. People, it's also so very, very clear. I mean, I'm contradicting myself. The simplicity is, everything's so simple that people get wrapped up in it and don't quite believe it because it's all so simple. But on the other hand, it's so massive that it becomes diffuse in terms of who do you go after, who would be part of the class, if I use American legal terms. So yeah, it could be pinned down, but frankly, I think I'm much more practical about it. That's the kind of thing where if you've got a really animated litigator and they've got their own income stream and they're secure and they've got a bee in their bonnet, fine and dandy, take some chunks out. I mean, go for them, jugular and all. But I wouldn't wait for that. I wouldn't depend on that. And I think most of the action will be in, and there are similar calls, by the way, for public inquiries here, which is basically where you have a state-appointed committee, similar to, I don't know, the Truth and Reconciliation Committee in South Africa. It's a vague analogy. It's not quite correct, but a state committee that looks into something calls for that here. all the judicial reviews, class actions, public inquiries, they're all at risk of missing the point by waiting, when most immediate gains will be highlighting there is a scientific consensus, it has implications, there are obligations that come from it, the obligation to be appropriately educated by an education source that's compliant with the scientific consensus. Well, that's substantiated by the elevated likelihood of unlawful clinical or judgment or decision making in a field, that's substantiated in turn by the empirical quantification of the disjoint of medicine from scientific norms, which is not the way it's worded. And I know the people well who wrote these things. It's not the way it's worded. It's the way I'm wording it. And that comes from their quantification of what are their belief systems? What do they think? And we know how that compares to the norms. So the action's going to be very boring. It's going to be letter writing. It's going to be sitting in front of a medic and saying, look, I know you're used to ignoring me here, but I've had a conversation and I'm perhaps beginning to take formal counsel. I don't know. It depends on the situation. Most patients are not going to be in a position to do that, though. So we're talking about changing norms and narratives. People aren't going to be in a position to do it because they don't have the knowledge, or they don't have the experience, or they're exhausted, and so there's just no scope to do it, even if they are capable of it, or their relationship with their medical providers so broken down that it requires a level of effort where it might be just better to go elsewhere. It all becomes very practical, but at the end of the day, it's about norms. Because if we're talking about a disjoint of medical norms from a scientific consensus, the only resolution is a change of norms. And the only way you can change norms is by aligning people's interests, and by making people aware of what their interests are. And that's what people and their paymasters, more to the point, are rarely aware of. Long answer, I think, to what you were saying.
Yeah. Well, this just has so much, I mean, I think people can look at this conversation and see it as a very, very distant sort of, they can still go into that mode of, I'm sorry, they're working in my kitchen. But that there's, oh, this is so far distance for me, but the thing is it applies to everything about healthcare, and so it's I think that it bodes well for people to wise up on everything regarding this, these concepts, and to view how they examine research and current standards, and their documentation and everything through these eyes, and ME just may be the way that leads them to tighten everything up,
Yeah. There's something absolutely fundamental that I failed to mention. When we were talking about the why, and why, if I'm a medical professional, why should I give a hoot? Why should I care? Well, we've got the liability, we've got the which side someone's bread is buttered on element of it as well. But then there's also the scale, and that's integral to this. So we know the prevalence numbers. Okay, there's discussion as to which prevalence number, if you compare it to the multiple sclerosis or Parkinson's, how does it compare in terms of prevalence? Depends which number you look at, but it's either broadly similar or more. Depends on which ones you look at. So we're talking huge. We're talking common. I mean, the word common is used versus multiple sclerosis, so we can use it for us. So rare condition, it annoys me when people say rare condition, because it's rare to have multiple sclerosis too, but depends how one defines rare, and that's described as common. Then at the other side of this, as well, in terms of the severity of what is the quality of life implication for ME. Again, we know the literature, we know how terribly it compares to pretty much everything, from multiple sclerosis, cystic fibrosis, congestive heart failure, even end-stage cancer, HIV, the full shebang of misery, we compare very badly to, in terms of, if you take the distribution of happy story, terrible story, our happy stories are worse than their happy stories, and our average and our worst stories are worse, sadly. So that weight is also a big part of describing the importance of it to the medical provider too. But at the end of the day, a lot of it's going to come back to resources that are shareable with a medical provider. Otherwise, it's just too much for someone to sit down in 10 minutes and say to their GP.
This is fascinating. I mean, I could, it just opens up so many offshoots to so many different important aspects of healthcare management issues, and then disease management, practice management. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And I'm fascinated by this.
It becomes normal, doesn't it? That's the thing. Suddenly the conversations start becoming, as soon as one stops suspending legal or compliance norms, all the other conversations start, and also scientific norms, because suddenly we live in a world of exemptions for scientific norms for us. All the conversations suddenly become normal.
Exactly. I haven't asked you many questions because I feel like you're preaching to the choir as far as Sally and I are concerned. I mean, the way you lay it out is just a very sound, sensible, simple argument, but in my head, I have situation after situation after situation, that comes to mind where I have, because Sally and I do advocacy work voluntarily, with what we do. And we're in the support groups also as ME patients. That's why we developed this group that we have in order to train other PTs and OTs how to properly treat ME, because we're patients in these Facebook groups. And we hear people say, well, the therapist made me do this, and I hate PTs, and we understand. I mean, we understand that. I mean, I tried all kinds of things on myself to get myself better, that, now I know what was basically graded exercise therapy, because that was what I learned as a PT. Thankfully, no one pushed it on me. I just did it to myself. But, we hear these people, and we hear, oh my, one thing that comes to mind that just infuriates me is the doctor said I need to find a good therapist, or I need to find a good psychiatrist. And then it turned out that the person was receiving disability and did not know that the reason used on their disability was conversion disorder. And that went on to be diagnosed with very specific neurological issues, which is the exact opposite of the definition of conversion disorder or FND and whatever. And, I hear that and I am infuriated, and this is a conversation that needs to happen, and I wrote down what you said as far as being nice has its limits. I think ultimately the dollar sign is what gets people's attention.
Yep. I totally agree. I totally agree. But I think the main thing that I want to leave everyone with is there needs to be a change in narrative. There has been screaming for the relatively short time that I've been ill, since 2017, compared to many people, short time, screaming for PR strategy. Often missing the point entirely. PR what? Just to say they're mean to me, or my science is bigger than your science? It's not enough. And getting most of the discussion that there is out there tends to be focused on minutiae. CBT, not CBT, get or not get. Now, in my training, I can go full Greek and talk about machine learning if I have to, but it's irrelevant. It's not the point. The points are much more elementary, and the elementary points are actually extremely powerful and extremely dangerous to people who don't want us to say them. Saying CBT is not relevant is an important foundation for talking about the scientific consensus, but it's not the killer point. Why? That's your opinion. I have an opinion too. De facto, there's a controversy. So I've just created the controversy, and because I created the controversy, my opinion is now valid. It exists. Therefore, it goes on for another 10 years. So a little circle there. So the only thing that matters is the erasure of controversy, because the controversy doesn't exist. There is no controversy. Zero, unless one debases the very definition of science. And that's, so that, I want to leave everyone with that thought, and for preparation for the fact that that change in narrative is going to be painful. There will be people who are profoundly uncomfortable with it, particularly in our community, and who conflate getting something done with being a screaming activist, which, if one is making statements that one can defend in a court of law, and if those statements are necessary to benefit patients, so one, they're defensible, and two, they actually matter and they're important, that's not screaming activism. That's saying what needs to be said when people don't want you to say it and have trained you to police yourselves not to say it, which is where we are just now.
Well, this is, I so appreciate you taking the evening to talk with us and introduce us to this. And thanks for your work with Doctors with ME also, because I know that's going to be a powerful organization to help shape the future.
It's an ongoing process. It's an ongoing process, and everyone's welcome. We're a very broad church in terms of professions. We're global. We're an umbrella organization. An important thing to note is we're a conduit for regionally produced content as well, which will be relevant to a number of you, or even as you perhaps formalize your body as well, may be relevant too, in terms of redistribution of content as well. Is that a mutual love? That's something to bear in mind.
So are we actually eligible to join as physiotherapists, as you call us?
Yep, exactly. We have different I'm trying to use the correct word. There's risk of sounding pejorative. We have different classifications of membership, and being a medical professional, a practitioner, puts you in a professional class. So that's not the same as someone who is an ME patient who knows the science, but isn't professionally engaged or never was professionally engaged, because at the end of the day, and we do have supporters as well, but at the end of the day, it's a professional association. So it's an AMA, it's a BMA, but for post-viral disease and related conditions, to quote the website.
Would we join individually or as a group, like we are?
As you wish. That's really one for you guys.
Well, thank you so much, and I'm glad we ran into you on Twitter, and we'll stay in touch.
We'll see you in the tweet sphere.
That sounds good. Thank you
so very much. Lovely seeing you guys.
Yeah, take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. Stay safe.
All right.
Bye.
Wowza.
Wow. Let me, I make sure, I think it, I don't know if it stopped recording.